What's the most awkward thing you've seen go down at a wedding? Wedding photographer here. Easily the worst was when the father of the groom, apparently entirely sober, gave a 10-minute toast that devolved into openly complaining that his son got to have sex with the bride and he didn't. And this wasn't a mistimed joke about how pretty she was. This was a full-on lament about growing old and how women didn't find him attractive anymore and that all he wanted was to take his daughter-in-law to bed. I got a few photos of the bride and groom reacting in horror to this, and then I went and hid with the catering staff in the kitchen, who were peeking out the door to observe the carnage. Saw a groom open up gifts and cards during the wedding and counting the money and calling people out on how much they gave them. Also saw his friend, maybe ex-friend now, grab the money he gave him and leave. Was awesome to see. Friend's wedding. In the middle of the vows when they reached the through sickness and health section, the pastor started going off on his life story, how he has had 3 wives and they all died horribly and so it's important to really mean the through sickness bit. Then at the end of the wedding, before he announced them as a couple, he asked his 4th wife to stand up. Really weird. Everyone was looking around at each other to see if it was a joke or not. I'd be concerned about the rate that guy is racking up dead wives. Wedding for my second cousin, the bride. The best man was absolutely wasted and was giving his speech. About halfway through, he says the bride's name and looks at her and loses his train of thought and just goes, "God, you're just so SI. I wish I would have FK'd you first." My dad was the best man at a low-key wedding. We went to a restaurant after and in his speech he thanked the father of the bride for paying for the meal. And it turned out we were all paying for our own meals. The father of the bride was mortified and so was my dad. The officiant, not sure if they were a priest or whatnot, forgot to say you may be seated before going through the ceremony and exchange of vows. The crowd didn't know what to do and just kept standing through the whole ceremony. After the ceremony everyone got up except one very old and frail looking lady who it transpired had passed away. The reception was rather subdued. Groomsman had a little too much vodka and decided to propel himself through a tempered glass door head first. Turns out tempered glass is really hard to break. His limp body proceeded to slide down a flight of cement stairs. As I was calling the ambulance, a bridesmaid was screaming in my face about how I was going to ruin the wedding and how he would be just fine, as he twitched and drooled in my lap, completely sauced, concussed, and a good ounce stupider than he was 5 minutes before. We all went out for drinks after they carted him off, but the girl wouldn't let it go. One of the groomsmen was dancing with the maid of honor and they did a dip maneuver. The problem with this being that the maid of honor's dress was strapless and her boobs had recently swelled up. She was pregnant, so that maneuver made them pop right out of the top of her dress in front of the whole dance floor. The groom ran full sprint around the wedding reception hall double fisting bottles of beer. He slipped on the ground and dislocated both of his hips. His father popped them both back in while the groom screamed through tears, while still clutching the beers. Went to a wedding where the first kiss as husband and wife was literally their first kiss. She went for the quick peck and he went for the dog licking its bowl clean style kiss. She was not happy about it. To go from your first kiss to losing your virginity to each other is a big jump. I was at a wedding, partner's cousin, and the bride's father. Very intoxicated. Started in a side with I have to say it. Apparently, the bride used to have a pretty serious drug and self-harm problem. He credited the groom with saving her life. Phrased correctly, that could have come out as high praise for him. Added to the speech after he got drunk, it came out as, "We're so lucky that she turned out okay." After her brief stint as a crack WHRE. Not optimal. My uncle was supposed to do a blessing for the dinner. Ended up talking about North Korea and how they better not travel there for their honeymoon. No one laughed. It was a very awkward 4 minutes. Oh god. At my cousin's wedding, her maid of honor was a complete and utter mess who said she wasn't going to give a speech. Then drank a bunch and insisted on it. She stood up and opened up her phone to the notes section and just started reading down this list of memories and then going off on tangents and then going back to the phone and saying whoops. Lost my place. Where was I? Full stop. And her stories were awful. They were about how she loved my cousin so much and hated the guy she married and how she thought he'd ruin their friendship. But she learned to tolerate him. It went on and on until one of my aunts started clinking her fork against her glass to get her to shut up, and everyone started doing it and the DJ had to come and turn off the microphone. So this girl sits down, crying, and opens her little purse and pulls out one of those giant vape pens and takes a big pull and then just chucks a massive cloud in the face of a groom. It was amazing. The bride's older brother gave a speech where he talked about how he changed her diaper when she was a baby. He then told the groom that because of this, he, the brother, saw her first. It was super gross and cringy. Didn't witness the incident thankfully, but got to see the awkwardness right after it happened. Groom gets completely drunk before the wedding even starts. So after drinking for a few hours at the reception he can barely stand. He still goes up to his new father-in-law and says he wants to talk to him. Walks into the bathroom. Father-in-law thinks that is odd, but maybe the groom wants a few words with no one around. They walk into the bathroom and the groom proceeds to pee all over the wall and then walk out, leaving his new father-in-law just standing there. The new father-in-law explained what happened to my date not long afterwards. As far as I know, it was never spoken of again. Went as a +1 to a wedding of a family I didn't know. Younger brother of the groom caused the ceremony to be 20 minutes late. They were running behind and getting no response from him. So they started the ceremony. He came in the middle of their vows and announced that he was sorry he was late. But he just found out that he and his girlfriend were having a baby. No one said anything and someone told him to sit down and be quiet. After the wedding ended I asked my friend WTF that was about and she told me that the brother was a known attention seeker and everyone was sick of his shitty. A few weeks later she gave me another update straight from the groom. There was no girlfriend. And no baby either. He'd made it up. Muslim groom. Hindu bride. Groom's family wasn't 100% in favor of this marriage. Maid of honor gave a lovely standard maid of honor speech. Groom's two brothers decided to go in a different direction. One spent 10 minutes screaming, red-faced, about the war in Iraq. This was 2004? And the other read a wonderful poem about how nothing is permanent and there are other fish in the sea. It was me at my sister's wedding. Got pissed drunk and started making out with a bridesmaid. Only to be caught by my super conservative Christian stepmother. I should also mention I was the maid of honor. The bridesmaid was my ex. And that neither of us were out to our families at the time. Who were both in attendance. Whoops. Was 14. On the dance floor with my two cousins who were the same age and one cousin who was about 35 at the time. A friend of the groom came up. Was very drunk. And put his arm around me. Asking if I wanted to go dance with him and his friends. 35-year-old cousin removed his arm from my shoulder. Calmly put his hand on the man's shoulder. And said, "That's illegal." With a smile. His face fell and he danced away. I felt so gross at the time but I can laugh about it now. Props to your cousin for being so classy about it. You know he would have had your back if the guy had gotten handsy. Not my wedding but was told about this from a wedding singer. One of their weddings turned into chaos when the groom snogged one of the bridesmaids at the bar. At the bar. In plain view of everybody. Fights ensued. Place got destroyed and the hotel kicked everybody out. I think the police were there. Snog means made out with for anyone imagining something far dirtier. And what a dumb f***ing groom. At least the bride dodged a bullet there. Last year I went to a wedding where the bride collapsed walking into the reception and had to be ambulanced out of her own wedding. Turns out she had been frantically taking care of last-minute wedding details the last few days and had almost zero sleep and was running entirely on Red Bull. She started having heart palpitations and had to spend a few days in the hospital, which sucks. as they were supposed to leave on their honeymoon the next day. The ironic part of it all was that it was also a dry wedding. I think the priest was a little of that day. While he was going through his talk right before the vows, he let his slip that "We're here for the funeral of friend's name." Then it got awkward quiet and his face looked horrified when he caught on why everyone was staring at him in disbelief. Or the groom, who gave almost 20-minute wedding vows with 8 bullet points to talk about and long drawn out story for each bullet point. I left early because I knew it was gonna be a shitty show and I didn't want to deal with police. The groom hit the bride's sister and then he was beaten by the other men. I was the best man at my brother's wedding. It was an outdoor wedding, and we had to walk down at least 50 yards to get to the front. All of the groomsmen and bridesmaids had gotten lined up, but we couldn't start walking down yet because my grandfather and his brother were standing in the middle of the aisle casually talking to each other. They didn't understand why people were yelling at them to sit down. But after a few minutes the wedding finally continued. My dad had this trashy backyard wedding that nobody wanted to be at. I was only there because my grandma made me go. Everyone was in casual clothes, which is cool. My dad wore an old dirty Walmart graphic tee to his own wedding. The only one who was really dressed up was my highly religious aunt, who was the only person who wasn't immediate family that showed up. When it was time for the I-dos, instead of just saying it, he chugged a beer, flipped a coin, and said "I guess." Nobody laughed and it was insanely awkward. The bride looked like she was about to cry. My whole family was embarrassed. And in the middle of the beer chugging, my aunt yelled "Michael, no," before the beer even touched his lips. Then walked out. My boyfriend freshman year of high school invited me to his dad's wedding reception. He picked me up in the limo and we drive to his dad's bar where the reception is. He tells me on the ride there that it was a shitty show and that both his dad and the bride were shit-faced walking down the aisle and his dad wouldn't stop grabbing the sister of the bride's ass. We get to the reception and we aren't there for 15 minutes before people start to whisper where the groom and the sister of the bride were. Then someone yells that the limo is gone too. The bride starts screaming, "Son of a f***ing bitch." The sister and the groom returned, doing the walk of shame into the dimly lit bar. The bride runs up and slaps her sister screaming, "Bitch." Then someone put some Skinhead on the jukebox and the party got started. Watch the maid of honor go into detail about how her and the bride would have sleepovers when they were younger and poop in the backyard because why not? She then tells the father of the bride that the majority of the poop he picked up in the yard was not from the dog. Bride had her head in her hands from the beginning of the story. My mother remarried 3 years ago to a fire chief of a major city. During the wedding ceremony, after the vows and right before my new stepfather was about to speak, one of my worst fears as a parent happened. I had just quietly told my daughter of 5 at the time to sit in her chair correctly. She was sitting on her knees in the chair trying to see amongst the crowd of tables. As she was transitioning to sit on her butt, she missed her hand placement on the table, slipped, and fell to the floor with the fork that she was eating cake with lodging directly into the back of her scalp. This caused a huge commotion. She started screaming, and everyone at the wedding party came rushing over to my daughter. Most were first responders, EMS or police. They all just started working immediately. The fork cut enough into her head that she needed staples. We completely ruined the last half of my mother's wedding, rushing my daughter to the hospital. Extremely awkward. At my cousin's wedding, all of the bridesmaids and groomsmen that gave speeches just talked about how much the couple fought. Needless to say, shortly after the wedding the husband cheated on her and they got divorced. Priest was asking the groom if his new bride and his mother, who was seated in the first row, were both drowning in a river and he could only save one. Whom would he save? Easy. Save bride. Throw priest in. Save mother. Well, I will say that I kinda figured that my wedding would have an awkward quality to it, being my now ex-wife's mother hated me. It was all good until the vows, when suddenly her mom starts ugly crying loudly and getting louder at specific words in the vows and almost ungodly loud when she said "I do." I almost turned towards her after to say, okay, we get it, you hate me, but I decided it would be best if she was the only one to make an ass of themselves. My so's parents witnessed this at an Irish wedding. The groom held a toast thanking the best man for doing so much for him and anything he asked for. And ended with, "But I don't remember asking you to FCK my wife." And walked out. At my friend's wedding. Her whole family is a shambles and awful to her, but she's so kind-hearted she invited them anyway. Her sister spent the entire wedding, bearing in mind as maid of honor she was there from 8 AM, telling the bride how fat she looked. And pointing at things and loudly declaring, well, at my wedding I wouldn't have X, it's tacky and awful, or I think I'll take that for my wedding, she won't mind. Her recent fiance looked like he was trying to drink himself to death. An extremely hyped up golden retriever ran through the ceremony. Circled the bride, my mom, 2 times. Woofed at the priest and bolted back out wiggling his tail. Happy as ever. Wouldn't say awkward. Rather a delightful little stir that reminded me of a cheesy ending in a 90s movie. Not as bad as the others on here. But I went to a buddy's wedding a few years ago. I had met one of his former co-workers a few times at bars. And my buddy told me how into him she was. So she was at the wedding of a guy she is obviously still crazy about. And as she gets drunker, it's obvious how miserable she is. On the way back to the hotel, I was talking to her. And she was sitting in front of the bride. And just holding back tears. When we got back, she went straight to her room and we didn't see her the rest of the night. Something I've wondered ever since is why you would go to a friend's wedding if you're crazy about them. And why my friend invited her in the first place. The bride and groom had been best friends for years and years. But only really dated for about 2 years. It was no surprise to anyone when they got engaged after that long. At their wedding following the bridal party introductions, the DJ asked how long they dated. They answered 2 years, which is technically true. The DJ proceeded to rant roast lecture the couple people in their late 20s for being hopeless irrational romantics who don't understand the long-term consequences of their decisions. They only dated for 2 years. There's definitely no way they were ready to get married. It was awkward. Mother of the groom got so wasted she started giving random men at the reception lap dances. Thanks, Mom. Truly a night to remember. Went to a wedding with an ex. She was the only bridesmaid. I was at the back of the barn, hipster wedding, just watching when I noticed my then GF wobble. She grabs the bride's shoulder to steady herself. Preacher pauses. Then continues. Then GF crashes to the ground like a ton of bricks. Entire thing stops. I run up to get her. Escort her out. Make her sit down and drink some juice, had some cheese, whatever was on hand. 1. She locked her knees. 2. She hadn't eaten anything all day. 3. She took some kind of ginseng caffeine pill. On an empty stomach. I was with her in the other room. So we didn't see the vows. But once it finished, the bride came out to check on her. People shuffling out. On their way to the bar. Now went to the bride to say congrats. Then to us to share their passing out at a wedding story. Apparently it's pretty common. An uncle stood up and told everybody to stay in place and symbolically lay hands on the happy couple. I lifted my arm up into the air in front of me. Realized what I was doing. And jerked it back down. Looking around. Bewildered. I faced a room of unwitting Nazi salutes. Semicolon. When I told my dad what had happened. He asked, did you get pictures? And now I am really regretting that I didn't. Well, my first wedding. My sister decided it would be the perfect place to have her boyfriend propose. I paid her back by using my Moss speech at her wedding to announce my pregnancy.